My husband caught me arm in arm with another man in public and attacked him. Then I went home and did this. I was careless and incredibly stupid to cheat on my marriage. The consequences I faced after my husband caught me having an affair outside our relationship were cruel and evil. I didn't realize I'd been married to someone so awful for years. I genuinely believed he was kind and loving, but it turns out I was mistaken. Have you ever found yourself in a situation you never imagined? I won't deny I was wrong for what I did because I was, and I suffered greatly for it. I never imagined I would find myself in such a humiliating situation one day. I really don't know what led me to another man's arms and why I made that selfish and destructive decision. My husband's only fault was loving and caring for me. Sometimes being a housewife gets dull, but I was content because my husband supported me financially. If I were to explain why I cheated, you probably wouldn't believe or understand, but I think it was greed and desire that drove me to betray my husband. I had everything I needed, and my husband ensured I lacked nothing, even sexually. Instead of staying loyal, I chose to betray my marriage and seek satisfaction elsewhere. But the aftermath of my wrongdoing wasn't pleasant, and he ensured that I regretted every single action I ever took against him in our marriage. My husband, Jim Carson, aged 32, and I, also 32, crossed paths at an Atlanta radio station. He appeared at the station for an interview regarding his remarkable real estate and construction enterprise. Besides, he generously supported several nursing homes and children's homes in Georgia, particularly in Atlanta. His philanthropic work was truly remarkable. I was the radio personality conducting his interview at the time. Following the interview, it coincided with my shift ending. Just to note, I hosted the evening drive from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. After wrapping up my duties, I requested him to wait as I intended to seek sponsorship for my non-governmental organization, NGO. We briefly discussed my NGO, and he handed me his business card, suggesting I reach out during business hours. I accepted the card, but I had no desire to engage with anyone else but him. Therefore, the next day, I dialed the number on the card and conveyed my request, subsequently securing an appointment to meet with Jim. 2 days later, I attended the meeting with Jim, where we discussed my aspirations and the community's needs, along with my earnest desire for sponsorship. From that point on, we swapped numbers. He shared his plans for phone conversations, and I was beyond thrilled. Our chats over the phone brought us gradually closer. A few weeks in, he generously covered my phone bill, drawing us even nearer. Later, he extended his generosity to my NGO, filling me with joy. He once escorted me to the orphanage he supported, showcasing his exceptional contributions. What struck me about Jim was his grounded nature. He dedicated himself to aiding others, driven purely by passion, not by the urge to showcase on social media. His actions were genuine, avoiding the spotlight of social media. His approach demonstrated that he engaged in these acts out of pure love, capturing moments with children and their caregivers without ever flaunting them online. So, whatever he was up to, sure, he snapped photos with the kids and their caregivers or nurses, but you'd never spot a single one of his actions on social media. He convinced me that if you're going to help someone, you should do it with a heart that's truly open and pure. Never help someone only to snap photos and show off your deeds all over the internet. His modesty and commitment to aiding others really touched me. Months down the line, we grew closer. He became a trusted advisor. Whenever I felt confused or needed advice, I knew he was there for me, no questions asked. I had someone I could rely on, someone to share everything with, whether it troubled me or brought me joy. He would brainstorm with me, figuring out solutions for my NGO, and I cherished every moment spent with him. You know how it feels when someone really gets who you are just a few months after meeting? That was Jim for me. He understood me completely, inside and out. From our friendship days up to our marriage, I learned so much. Jim is incredibly intelligent, bursting with talents, and has an amazing mind. He's got a sharp eye for business, which I really admire because he relentlessly pursues his plans and dreams. We were friends for over 7 months, and that period was a golden chance for me to really get to know Jim. Eventually, we started dating. We became inseparable, often visiting the places he supported and lending a hand to those in need. After making our relationship official, we reveled in the joy of dating for a few months until he proposed on February 14th. I can't pretend I wasn't over the moon because I truly was ecstatic. It felt like all my dreams had come true. I mean, I had found my soulmate, my guide, my best friend. I had discovered the perfect match in Jim, and I couldn't imagine wanting anyone else. He was my everything. We tied the knot during the summer break in June, making me the happiest woman alive. Our marriage was pure joy. I had all I ever wanted, a husband who was loving, caring, and supportive. A few months into our marriage, Jim and I discussed starting a family. I was eager to build our own little world with him. However, Jim suggested I take an early retirement to ensure I was well rested and my body ready for pregnancy. I trusted that stepping back from my job meant Jim would take care of me completely. I was already receiving a generous allowance from him just for being his wife, no longer needing my salary since he was covering all our financial needs. I wanted for nothing, enjoying intimacy, care, Jim's time, and his undivided attention. Yet, I found myself wondering why I felt the need to lead a double life when I had everything from Jim and more. As time went on, staying at home began to feel monotonous. Jim was always tied up with his job, especially since his construction business took off, landing more projects than ever. They were swamped with work, given they specialized in building construction. While I was thrilled to see my husband's business thriving, since it meant a boost in our income, it started to strain our connection. Our conversations seemed to revolve solely around his work and the numerous projects his company was tackling. Honestly, it got pretty dull at times because work dominated our discussions. Even during dinner, he'd talk about the next big project or the homes he needed to remodel for his real estate venture. Jim is incredibly focused and hardworking, but there were moments when I really missed him. I longed for his affection, his humor, and just being with him. One day, out of sheer boredom and seeking some excitement, I found myself downloading a dating app. I was craving some genuine connection and intimacy, something beyond my own company. As I swiped through profiles, one particular man caught my eye, Eric Mayer, a 33-year-old with striking features. His profile pictures showcased his slim, well-defined physique, fair skin, and captivating green eyes. Just glancing at his photos sent a thrill through me. Wow, I thought. Not long after, Eric messaged me and we hit it off instantly through the app. Our conversations flowed effortlessly, as if we'd been friends for years. There was undeniable chemistry between us, a real sense of connection. After chatting for a few days, we exchanged numbers and began texting through a popular messaging app, even moving on to video calls. Well, not just normal video calls, but those nasty and freaky video calls. The ease with which we communicated made it feel like we were building something special. I had convinced myself that Eric was the one meant for me. Our desires aligned perfectly, and our connection was indescribable. As weeks flew by, Eric and I managed to meet up twice, and each encounter left me more enthralled than the last. His presence was electrifying. It's not that my husband lacked passion, but his constant busyness left a void. His occasional financial support and sporadic kisses couldn't fill the gap of deep, exciting intimacy I yearned for. I craved someone who could transport me to another dimension, to experience euphoria beyond my wildest dreams. Jim, caught up in his world, was absent from mine, prompting me to seek fulfillment with Eric. He ensured my complete satisfaction, guiding me to peaks of bliss I hadn't known before. Our affair took root from these moments, evolving into something undeniable by our third meeting. We were insatiable, drawn to each other with an intensity that overshadowed everything else. Caught in the thrill, I navigated a double life, torn between my love for my husband and the exhilarating escapades with Eric. My heart belonged to Jim, but Eric's touch ignited a fire within me that I couldn't resist, leading me down a path of secrecy and dual existence. This clandestine affair had been unfolding for months, shrouded in a web of lies and deceit. I was acutely aware that if Jim ever discovered it, the fallout would be catastrophic. My actions were undeniably selfish and driven by greed, with my liaison with Eric centered purely around the physical connection we shared. Though emotions were entangled in this affair, my heart could never belong to Eric as it did to Jim. In our recklessness, Eric and I failed to consider the potential repercussions, lost in our private world of passion. Eric had a way of making me feel valued, showering me with the time and attention I craved. Meanwhile, I understood that Jim's relentless work ethic was fueled by his desire to provide a comfortable life for us, ensuring he could care for me without any financial burdens. On a day that would forever mark a turning point, Eric and I were meandering through the park, blissfully ensconced in our own world, oblivious to the approach of my husband Jim from the opposite direction. As we rounded a bend, there he stood, a portrait of shock and betrayal. His initial shock rapidly morphed into fury as he confronted us, deeply wounded and enraged by my infidelity. His anger was palpable, far surpassing mere rage, and in his tumultuous state, he directed his fury towards Eric, sparking a physical confrontation that left us all rattled and mortified. I was at a loss for words, fully aware that any attempt to explain would only fuel his anger. In a desperate bid to defuse the situation, I tried to pull Jim away from Eric, but the conflict escalated. Onlookers gathered, drawn to the spectacle as if it were a public performance. Jim, driven by an unstoppable fury, seemed beyond reach. My efforts to intervene only resulted in me accidentally catching a blow. When bystanders realized the intensity of Jim's assault, they stepped in to break up the fight. Eric fought back, but Jim's strength was overwhelming. The power he exhibited was unlike anything I had witnessed before. Attempting to calm the storm, I uttered the cliched defense of the guilty, but Jim dismissed me with a look that chilled my bones, indicating I would find him at home before departing. In the aftermath of the turmoil, we all went our separate ways, the air thick with tension and my heart heavy with guilt. The journey home was a solemn one, filled with dread and contemplation of the irreparable damage done. My mind kept pondering what awaited me at home, and I felt apprehensive about returning, especially knowing Jim was still angry. Despite my fear of facing him, I knew I had to confront the situation to move forward. I hoped he would believe my lie and forgive me. I didn't want to lose my husband over a brief affair and desires. However, sometimes hopes remain just that. Hopes. Upon entering our empty house, the reality of the recent events hit me hard. I was shocked to find smoke emanating from the car garage. I feared Jim may have harmed himself, so I hurried to the source of the smoke. In the garage, I saw Jim holding all the new clothes I had purchased with his money, setting them ablaze. Despite my pleas for him to stop and attempts to intervene, he slapped me and ordered me to gather my old clothes and leave his house. I couldn't believe Jim's actions. Admittedly, I wronged Jim in a deeply hurtful way, and my actions were indeed inexcusable. However, his response was beyond what I believed was justified. His confrontation with Eric was one thing, but to destroy my clothes simply because he had purchased them crossed a line. I had naively thought that the destruction of my wardrobe might quench his rage. Little did I realize, the head of our household had plans to take his retribution further, actions far more severe than a mere bonfire of my belongings. In the days that followed, I retreated to my old apartment, a place I had called home during my days working at the radio station. I honored Jim's demand for me to leave our shared home, but the emotional toll was immense. To describe my state as merely heartbroken does not capture the depth of my despair. I was utterly devastated. Left with nothing but ill-fitting attire from my past, my situation seemed grim. In my solitude, I managed to gather some basic groceries, enough to sustain me for a few days, harboring a sliver of hope that Jim's anger might subside and there could be a chance to mend our fractured marriage. The absence of Jim left a void in my heart, emphasizing how incomplete my life felt without him. A month into my solitude, my landlord approached me for the monthly rent, despite my prolonged wait for a call from Jim, a call that never came. I had reached out to him countless times, flooding his phone with messages and calls, clinging to the hope that he might respond. To the landlord, I promised I would retrieve the rent money after a quick trip to the shops. At the grocery store, after selecting all the necessary items, my confidence plummeted at the checkout. The moment of truth turned into a nightmare as my card was declined repeatedly. In desperation, I tried other cards, only to face the same humiliating outcome. Venturing to an ATM provided no relief, offering only a useless slip in return. The situation grew increasingly mortifying, not just for me but for the line of impatient customers behind me, all delayed by my futile attempts to access my funds for what felt like an eternity. I made a bold decision to head straight to the bank branch to unravel the mystery behind why my money wasn't flowing from any of my cards. Upon arrival, I sought assistance and was hit with the most jaw-dropping news imaginable. The bank informed me that my accounts were bone dry, and worse yet, the one Jim had opened for me was flagged as fraudulent. It was an utter disbelief. Picture this. I had no food in the apartment, rent unpaid. My life was essentially in shambles. Jim had single-handedly wreaked havoc on my existence, all because of an affair I had with Eric. The cruelest twist? He didn't even grant me the chance to explain myself. Sure, he probably wouldn't have believed me, but I felt an overwhelming urge to make him understand my actions. After all, I felt neglected, and it was all his doing. I'm not suggesting he neglect his work and projects, but he needed to remember he had a wife waiting at home, longing for his time and affection. I needed him desperately, but he was nowhere to be found. I grappled with the aftermath of my choices and the heavy consequences of my infidelity, engulfed by a whirlwind of regret, shame, and confusion. I felt utterly lost, unsure of how to pick up the pieces. Jim had delivered the final blow to my already crumbling life, leaving me utterly broken with no way to bounce back. Without a dime to my name, I realized I had no choice but to return home. I phoned my mom, desperate for help, but she wasn't around. Luckily, she wired me some cash, just enough to get me from Georgia to Virginia Highland. My heart was in tatters, and thoughts of the worst crossed my mind, but the mere thought of my mother's pain stopped me. She was deeply disappointed in me when she learned the truth about Gemini. She questioned me once, but I couldn't muster the courage to give her the real story. Instead, I fed her lies, unable to admit what truly happened in my marriage. I suspect she reached out to Jim, seeking the truth, because a day after my deceit, she stormed into my room, fury etched on her face. She was livid and let down, demanding to know why I strayed from my marriage, parading my affair in public while knowing Jim's constant travels for business. I knew my actions would have consequences, but I never anticipated the magnitude of the fallout. My life was shattered, a swift reckoning that felt like karma arriving sooner than expected. I inflicted the worst pain on Jim, but did he have to retaliate like this? I retreated to my room for months, grappling with the wreckage of my marriage. 2 weeks into my stay at home, a postman dropped off an envelope right on my doorstep, and I was utterly shocked. I had been holding on to a sliver of hope that Jim might snap out of it, especially since he hadn't sent over any divorce papers. Turns out he had waited all this time, making sure I was at my lowest, before sending those divorce papers. It broke me into pieces. I felt so low, not even wanting to step outside. All I yearned for was to vanish, to find a corner of the world where nobody knew my name. I holed up inside for months, until I realized it was time to pick up the pieces. Thankfully, my mom was there for me, finding me a therapist who dedicated heaps of time to help me talk through the mess of my marriage. It wasn't easy, but after 2 weeks, her patience paid off. I finally started talking, and with that, I began to release the weight of my past, aiming my sights on what's ahead. In a moment of real clarity, I recognized it was time to own up to my part in everything and confront the consequences head-on. A couple of weeks into my journey back to myself, I was piecing my life back together, bit by bit. I realized that to truly move forward, I needed to start with forgiving myself and Jim. So, I sat in my room and penned down a sincere letter to my husband, expressing my deep regret and seeking his forgiveness. I acknowledged my mistakes. I had been blinded by greed and desires that led me down a wrong path. It was a lot to process, but I was determined to tackle it step by step and embrace life fully. I even started applying for positions at various radio stations, hopeful that my experience and tenure at the Atlanta radio station would tip the scales in my favor and secure me a spot. My mom was my pillar of strength and the support I desperately needed. She's irreplaceable, my anchor and protector. She instilled in me the belief that things would turn around and I would find healing in time. My split from Jim had left me in ruins. I doubted I could ever rise again, yet with divine strength, I found myself standing taller than before. Now, what I owe myself is to forgive Jim for the upheaval in my life. I'm ready to move on, yet there's a part of me that still yearns for Jim, holding me back. I'm at a loss on how to approach Jim about this. I could use some guidance on this matter. Please help me because I really don't know how I can approach Jim. Please advise me on this one.
All right, that was a fun story. Now let's move on to another exciting one. Stay tuned and let's dive in.
The moment Lisa walked through the door, I looked at her and just knew. I sensed that my wife had cheated. She had said she had to work late, and maybe she did. But somehow I felt she did more than work. How did I know? Some of it was just intuition, and some was the way she looked and acted when she came home that night, nervous and uneasy. Lisa was terrible at hiding her feelings. Unlike her, I'm good at keeping a poker face, so I didn't let on that I suspected my wife of 5 years had done anything wrong. Instead, I hired a private investigator because I wanted proof. Lisa and I were both 27 years old. We met in college during our senior year and dated for 2 years before getting married. I thought we shared the same values, including total fidelity to each other. Before we got married, I made it clear that cheating was a deal breaker for me. Sadly, until now, I believed we had a perfect life together. I'm not the type of guy who focuses solely on his career and ignores his wife. On the contrary, I always showed her affection by buying her flowers and gifts, taking her out on dates, and ensuring our bed life was satisfying because I have a high sex drive. People have told me I'm good looking, and I work out to stay in shape. Sure, I have my flaws, but neglecting my wife isn't one of them. Lisa might not be what some would call a knockout, but she's pretty with a nice figure. Her breasts aren't large, but they're not small either, and she has curves in the right places. Lisa works as a paralegal for a prestigious law firm. Usually she's home at the end of the workday, but occasionally she has to work late on important cases. I work in the high-tech field and earn a good income. Lisa comes from a well-off family. Her dad owns a big ranch in Texas with oil. He wanted us to sign a prenup. It said that if we divorced, our pre-marriage assets couldn't be touched, and any family inheritance would also be exempt. Since I wasn't marrying her for money, I didn't mind signing. I never liked her dad because he was racist, always saying bad things about blacks and Mexicans. But I didn't see that in Lisa, and since we lived far from them and didn't spend much time with them, it was okay. The private investigator I hired was recommended by a friend who used him to catch his cheating wife. My friend was impressed with how well he worked. The day after I started suspecting something was wrong, I went to the PI's office and told him what I needed. Once he agreed and I paid him, he started working on the case. It took a few days after what I thought was her first time cheating for my wife to go back to acting normal. I kept acting like a loving husband, and she probably thought she got away with it. Exactly a week later, she said she had to work late again. I called the PI to let him know. When she got home, she looked a little guilty, but not as bad as the first time. She was probably getting used to the idea that I wouldn't find out, and she could do what she wanted. The next day, the investigator called me and confirmed my suspicions. She was having sex with some guys from her workplace, right in the offices after everyone else had left for the day. Apparently, he took some photos through the window from a building across the street, but they weren't very clear. He asked me if I wanted him to keep investigating, and I asked if he could get video evidence. He said it could be done, but would cost more. I wasn't short on money, so I told him to go ahead and do it. Meanwhile, I got sick with a stomach virus, which I used as an excuse to avoid having sex with my wife, or at least, that's what I told Lisa. I just hoped I hadn't already caught an STD from her. Then I put my plan into action. One of my hobbies is playing poker. I'd meet up with friends maybe once a month for a game. I usually did pretty well, so I figured I wasn't too bad for an amateur. I also played poker online. Nothing too high stakes, just games with $5 or $10 buy-ins. We had saved up a nest egg of over 200 grand, and since I'd contributed the most, I didn't want Lisa to get any of it. That's where online poker came in. With my knowledge and skills, I set up 5 untraceable accounts on a poker site to work through. All the accounts belonged to me, so I could play against myself in one-on-one matches and intentionally lose. Sure, I lost some money to the site's rake, but it was less than what Lisa would get in a divorce. It seemed less suspicious to lose our money to 5 different players than just one. The site I used wasn't based in the US, so they were unlikely to share any client information. It took a week, but by then, I had emptied our bank accounts, leaving only 10 grand. Exactly 1 week later, Lisa called again, claiming she had to work late. I informed the private investigator, and he assured me he had it under control. When my wife returned home this time, there was barely any sign of guilt. She was becoming skilled at cheating. The next morning, the investigator called to say he had what I needed. I went to his office and picked up the DVD. He offered to provide a written report in a couple of days, but I told him the DVD would suffice. I paid him for his services and said I would reach out if I needed anything else. He expressed sympathy for the situation, but I reassured him that he had nothing to apologize for. He wasn't the one being cheated on. With the DVD in hand, I returned to work, locking myself in my office and instructing my assistant not to disturb me. I realized I wasn't anxious when I pressed play. Honestly, I already knew she was cheating on me, so watching the video wouldn't change anything. It seemed the video was filmed with a hidden camera in the law office, with clear picture and sound quality. I didn't want to know how the PI managed it. I just cared that I got what I wanted. Although I hadn't met the man my wife was involved with, the PI provided me with a lot of details about him. I knew he was married with 2 kids, his parents' identity, his hometown, and where he attended church with his family. What I didn't know, and only discovered from the video, was that he was black. Now, I know what you might be thinking. She was after a well-endowed black man. However, when I saw him, I noticed he wasn't any more well-endowed than me, maybe even slightly smaller. I watched the video without feeling anything. I had already lost all emotions for her. I've heard of guys in my situation becoming emotional wrecks, wanting to understand why their wives did what they did. Personally, I didn't care. She did it, and that's all that mattered to me. I really didn't care about the reasons behind it. One thing I did notice was that neither of them mentioned me or his wife while they were together. The Zex wasn't particularly interesting. The only thing that stood out was them criticizing the partners of the law firm. Interesting. After watching the video, I went to my boss and explained that I needed a week off for personal reasons. We were pretty close, so I gave him a brief overview of what was going on and asked for his help in covering for me. I mentioned that I needed to leave town for a few days. He understood, having experienced his own ex-wife's infidelity 2 years ago, and was very supportive. He suggested an idea to make my absence legitimate without using vacation time. He gave me a list of out-of-state customers that he thought it would be beneficial for me to visit. This way, I had a valid reason to be away, and I didn't have to dip into my vacation days. I left work early, packed a suitcase, and called my wife. I informed her that one of our out-of-state clients had a major computer system emergency, requiring me to travel immediately. While occasional business trips weren't unusual, they weren't frequent either. She expressed her love and said she'd miss me, urging me to return soon. I simply replied that I had to hurry to catch my flight. I'm not sure if she noticed that I didn't tell her I loved her back. I took a flight out of state and started the next phase of my plan. I made several copies of the video and put them in mailers, addressing them. To distance myself from them, I sent them overnight to an old college friend on the East Coast. I called and asked him for a favor, telling him he'd receive a box for next-day delivery. All he had to do was open it, take each mailer, and drop them in the mail to show where they were sent from. I was halfway across the country with witnesses confirming my location and that I was working. I know it sounds a bit secretive, and if things went as I expected, it might have been excessive, but I wanted to ensure what I was doing couldn't be traced back to me. I sent a video to every person I could find who worked for Lisa's law firm. Others were sent to the man's wife, parents, and pastor. One was sent to my wife's parents and their church's preacher, along with copies to all her old friends and our current ones. Some guys might be embarrassed to have their friends know their wives cheated on them. Not me. She was the one who broke her vows and betrayed me. I was the innocent victim. The final one arrived at my home address for me. Each video came with a list of amateur sites where I had anonymously posted it for everyone to see. By Thursday, things started to go downhill. I don't have all the details, but my wife and her lover were called into their boss's office, shown the video, and promptly fired. Then, My wife began getting calls from friends who had seen the video. Her dad called, screaming at her over the phone, and told her never to contact him or her mother again. On Friday, a couple of our friends called my mobile asking about the videos. I told them I was away working and had no idea what they were talking about. They filled me in on what was going on. It was comforting to know that some of my friends were more loyal than my cheating wife. I phoned home, and a very nervous Lisa answered. I informed her about the calls from our friends regarding the video. Then, I said I was heading to the airport to fly home, and that if the rumors were true, she should be gone by the time I arrived, and she should get a lawyer. She was gone when I got home, leaving with only a few clothes. Later, I learned she was staying with a divorced friend who had been unfaithful. I contacted a lawyer and initiated the divorce proceedings. I informed Lisa that I never wanted to see her again, and the only communication between us would be through our lawyers. Lisa's lawyer wasn't very reputable. After our situation became public, most lawyers avoided her. It seems her former employer had spread the word that she was unwelcome. When I stated our assets were 10 grand, she was furious. However, I had enough proof to show that I had lost the rest through gambling, and I did so before discovering her infidelity. Our only other asset was the house, but due to the housing market decline, we would lose money if we sold it. We had only lived there for 3 years, but Lisa didn't grasp that and obtained a court order to sell the house and split the proceeds. I wasn't bothered, as I didn't plan to stay in the house, and she couldn't afford the mortgage without a job. I had to pay 8 grand to settle the mortgage after the sale, leaving our net worth at 2 grand. She also filed for alimony. The final decision was that she was responsible for not having a job, even though she was capable of working, so alimony was refused. I handed her a check for $1,000, but she owed more than that to her lawyer. She had ruined her own situation, and now she was shattered, practically without any friends and with no family to rely on. She also realized she wouldn't find work in our city again since the scandal was widely known. She had no option but to relocate out of state. I threatened to sue Lisa's former employer, arguing they should have been aware of the affair between 2 employees who were married to others, especially as it occurred during work hours in their offices. We settled for $300,000, which they paid willingly to put an end to the mess. They didn't want any more negative publicity damaging their reputation further. I withdrew my funds from the online poker site and recovered most of my money. With the settlement from the law firm, I ended up in a good financial position. I would have given up everything to still have a loving and loyal wife, but I couldn't change the situation. What I do know about Lisa in recent years is that she works as a waitress, struggling to make ends meet. It seems that whenever she applied for a better job, a copy of her infamous video would mysteriously surface at the company she applied to. I suppose a wife who cheats in the office while on the clock and speaks negatively about her employers doesn't fare well on her resume. As for me, well, I have a few female friends with benefits. I might consider getting married again. Who knows? Both my parents and grandparents have had successful, long-lasting marriages. Maybe I'll be fortunate enough to meet the right woman. Of course, I'll make sure she understands my stance on cheating, even though it didn't work out well with Lisa and me.